Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the sources you send us, the things you're curious about, and, well, we dive deep to pull out the key insights. Fast, but thorough.
That's the idea. And today we've got some really interesting academic research you sent in.
Yeah, we're tackling a question that, honestly, I think puzzles a lot of people. Why do folks support or, oppose income redistribution?
And specifically, we're looking beyond just the straightforward economic arguments. This paper digs into the psychology of it all.
Exactly. It uses this rigorous academic approach, which promises some pretty surprising insights, I think, especially into why people who seem to be in similar economic boats can have totally different views on redistributing wealth.
It's a classic puzzle.
It really is. The paper kicks off with this central paradox. Why do some lower-income groups, the example often used is blue-collar workers, say, here in the U.S. sometimes seem to want less redistribution compared to similar groups in other wealthy countries?
And why do they often seem more, well, nationalistic, more focused on national pride?
Right. It feels like a contradiction, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And I bet you listening have probably wondered about that too. So our mission today.
To unpack those hidden factors, the stuff beyond just what's in it for me economically.
We're aiming for those aha moments, trying to connect the dots. Okay, so let's get into it. This central paradox. It's fascinating because it challenges that simple economic model.
It really does. And the paper argues pretty strongly that to get a handle on this, we absolutely need to look past just economics and really consider the role of social identity.
Social identity.
Yeah.
Okay, let's break that down. What does the paper actually mean by that? Sometimes those terms can feel a bit, jargony.
Sure. So the basic idea is that we all identify with certain social groups. Could be your nation, could be your social class, could be something else entirely. And the sense of belonging, this identification, it really shapes our preferences.
So it affects what we want, what policies we support, including things like redistribution.
Precisely. Your sense of who your group is influences what you think is good for the group and therefore what you support.
Okay, so it's not just about my individual bank balance. It's about who are my people. Got it. Does the paper break that down more?
It does, yeah, into two main components. First is group status. Basically, we care about how our group is doing, how it's perceived. Is it seen as high status, wealthy, prestigious?
Right, like wanting your team to win or feeling pride if your country is seen positively on the world stage. Makes sense. We want our groups to look good. What's the second bit?
The second is perceived similarity, or the paper uses this phrase, distance in conceptual space.
Okay, conceptual space.
Yeah, it sounds a bit abstract, but it just means how similar we feel to the other members of our group. Are we alike in important ways? Things like income, sure, but also maybe shared values, background, lifestyle, national identity markers.
So it's that feeling of, yeah, these people are like me. We fit together. Less distance means more similarity.
Exactly. The paper kind of uses this analogy of fitting into a category. The closer you feel to the sort of prototype member of that group, the stronger you probably identify with it.
Okay, group status and feeling similar. Got it. So how does that connect back to views on redistributing income?
Well, if you strongly identify with a group, your preferences start to reflect what's good for the group status, and you also value that similarity with others in the group.
So this could explain why people sometimes support things that help their group, even if it's not the absolute best outcome for them personally.
Sure.
Like seeming altruism.
Yes, exactly. But it's often what the paper, borrowing from Hegel, calls particular altruism. It's directed towards your in-group.
Not necessarily towards everyone equally. So maybe being really generous to your local community, but less keen on broader national welfare programs.
That's the kind of distinction this framework helps explain. Social identity theory here is really about that in-group focus.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, the paper really zooms in on class versus national identity.
Right.
How does that play out with redistribution?
Right. So building on this idea that our group identity matters, the model looks specifically at people identifying primarily with their social class, simplified here as poor or rich, or with their nation.
And how does that influence support for redistribution?
The paper suggests there are basically two potential stable states, or equilibria, as they call them.
Equilibria. Okay, interesting. What's the first one?
First is class identification. So imagine lower-income individuals primarily see themselves as working class or poor.
Right.
In that state, they're likely to show stronger support for redistribution. Why? Because those policies directly aim to improve the economic standing and thus the status of their class.
Makes sense. If I feel I'm part of the have-nots, I want policies that help the have-nots.
And interestingly, the paper suggests that higher redistribution can actually reinforce that class identity because it visibly lifts the status of that lower class. It makes being part of that group feel, well, better.
So it's a feedback loop, potentially. More redistribution strengthens class identity, which leads to demands for more redistribution. Okay, what's the alternative state?
The alternative is national identification. In this scenario, lower-income individuals identify more strongly with the nation as a whole. Their primary identity isn't poor person within this nation, but member of this nation.
And the effect on redistribution views.
Generally less support for it. Their focus shifts. It's more about the nation's overall status, its standing in the world, maybe its unity, rather than specifically closing the income gap within the nation.
So national pride might sort of overshadow class disadvantage in their minds.
That's the idea. And the paper even flips the feedback loop. It suggests that low redistribution can actually make identifying with your lower economic class less appealing, potentially pushing people towards national identity instead.
Wow, okay. So if the system isn't doing much to lift your class up, maybe you find more psychological reward in identifying with the nation. That's quite a thought. What pushes people towards one identity or the other then?
Several things seem to matter. A big one is those perceived distances we talked about.
How similar or different groups feel.
Exactly. So if there's a strong sense of national commonality, maybe everyone feels united against an external threat, or there's a very strong shared culture that can boost national identification among the poor.
Or like a rally around the flag effect, making internal divisions seem less important.
Right. Or conversely, if the lower income group itself feels very diverse internally, maybe lots of different backgrounds or values within that group that can weaken class identification and make national identity more attractive.
So diversity within the lower class could actually reduce support for redistribution by making a unified class identity harder to form.
That's what the model predicts, yes. It's a really interesting potential link between social dynamics and economic policy preferences. This feels like one of those potential aha moments you mentioned.
Definitely. It connects abstract theory to things we might observe.
Right.
What else influences the dominant identity?
Another factor is what the paper calls exogenous group status. Basically, the pre-existing status of the groups.
Meaning?
Well, if a nation already has really high international standing, lots of prestige, that makes identifying with the nation more attractive, right?
Sure. You want to be part of a winning team.
And similarly, the existing income distribution before taxes and transfers affects the perceived status of the lower class. Now, here's where it gets a bit counterintuitive again.
Uh-oh. Brace myself.
Maybe. The model suggests that higher pre-tax inequality could, in some situations, actually lead the poor to identify more nationally and support less redistribution.
Wait, run that by me again. More inequality, leading the poor to want less help to reduce that inequality. How? That seems backwards from a purely economic standpoint.
I know, it feels odd, but think of it psychologically. If the economic gap is enormous and your class feels really low status, maybe focusing on shared national pride is a more appealing way to feel good about your identity, a way to connect to something bigger and more positive than your immediate economic group.
So it's like, my class situation isn't great, the gap is huge, so I'll double down on being a proud member of this great nation instead. That's like, yeah, that's definitely an aha moment. Mind-bending, really. Is there another factor?
Yes, one more key concept. Multiple equilibria.
Meaning?
It means that even with the same basic economic conditions, the same institutions, a society could potentially settle into either state, the high redistribution strong class identity state, or the low redistribution strong national identity state. Both could be stable.
So there's not one inevitable outcome?
Nope. It suggests that history, path dependence, maybe specific events or powerful narratives can push a society down one road or the other, and once it's on that road, it can be kind of self-reinforcing.
Like a ball rolling into one valley or another, a small nudge early on could have long-lasting consequences.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a really rich theoretical picture, but does it actually match reality? What does the evidence say?
Good question. The paper does try to test these ideas using real-world data.
Okay. Did they find this link between national identity and lower support for redistribution?
They did, quite clearly. In many cases, they looked at big international surveys, things like the World Values Survey, ISSP, across a lot of developed democracies.
Okay.
And they found a pretty strong negative correlation. People with higher national pride tended to support less income equalization.
Even after accounting for their own income.
Yes, that's the crucial part. It wasn't just rich people being nationalistic and opposing redistribution. Even comparing people at the same income level, the ones with more national pride were less supportive of making incomes more equal.
That's a significant finding. Was it true everywhere?
It showed up pretty consistently in places like Austria, Britain, Canada, Finland, Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, Taiwan, and the U.S.
A lot of places.
Yeah, there were a few exceptions like Belgium, Italy, Spain. The authors kind of speculate that maybe in those countries, other identities like regional ones might be playing a stronger role, complicating the picture.
Now, since identities are complex, what about the other prediction? That poorer people tend to be more nationalistic.
Generally, the data seem to support that too. Within most countries studied, individuals with lower incomes did tend to report stronger national identification compared to wealthier individuals.
Why might that be?
Well, the paper suggests a couple of reasons based on the theory. Maybe the perceived status of their own economic class is lower, making national identity more appealing. Or perhaps they feel numerically more similar to the sort of average citizen or the national prototype than wealthier elites do.
Interesting. So within countries, you often see this pattern. Poorer people, more nationalistic, less keen on redistribution. Wealthier people, maybe less nationalistic, more okay with the status quo. What about comparing between countries?
That's where the evidence gets really striking, actually. They compared the overall level of national identification in different established democracies with the actual amount of income redistribution happening in those countries.
How do they measure redistribution?
They looked at how much the income share of a bottom 20% increases after taxes and government transfers, kind of a measure of how much the system lifts the bottom up.
Okay. And the correlation with national identity?
Strongly negative. Countries where national identification was more prevalent tended to have significantly lower levels of redistribution. The statistical relationship, the R-squared values, were surprisingly high, suggesting national identity explained a lot of the variation.
Can you give an example?
Well, think about Germany and the U.S., which often come up. Germany, at the time of the studies, generally showed lower average national pride and had higher redistribution. The U.S. showed higher national pride and had lower redistribution.
Fitting the pattern.
It seemed to. And one other interesting point on the cross-country data, they didn't find a consistent link between overall ethnic diversity at the country level and lower redistribution.
Oh, because some theories suggest diversity makes redistribution harder.
Right, but this data didn't strongly support that at the national level. The authors suggest this might bolster their model's point. Perhaps it's not overall diversity, but specifically diversity within the lower class that matters more for weakening class solidarity and thus reducing support for redistribution.
Back to that idea of perceived similarity within the group. Very nuanced. So pulling this all together, what are the bigger implications, the takeaways?
Well, one implication that really stands out is the potential incentive for political elites.
How so?
If emphasizing national identity, national threats, or national unity tends to dampen public demand for income redistribution, well, you can see how that might be strategically useful for elites who prefer lower taxes or less government spending on welfare.
So waving the flag could be a way to distract from economic inequality, essentially.
The research certainly suggests that's a plausible dynamic. When you hear strong appeals to national unity, especially during times of rising inequality, this framework gives you a lens to think critically about what might be driving that rhetoric. It's not just patriotism, potentially.
That's a really powerful, maybe slightly cynical takeaway, but perhaps realistic. Could it backfire, though?
That's a good point. The paper doesn't delve too deeply into that, but one could imagine scenarios where it does. What else?
Well, flipping it around, the paper also hints that major shocks that hit the poor hardest, think a deep recession, maybe a pandemic disproportionately affecting low-wage workers, could potentially increase class identification.
Right. If economic hardship becomes really stark and shared among a large group, that shared experience might make class identity more salient again, possibly leading to stronger demands for redistribution.
That definitely feels relevant to recent events. And you mentioned earlier the link to working class voters shifting towards nationalist parties in Europe.
Yes, the paper touches on that. It suggests this model offers one way to understand that shift. If immigration changes the perceived composition of the working class, Some native-born workers might feel less similar to others in their economic bracket.
They feel that distance increasing.
Exactly, and that might lead them to identify more strongly with their national group instead, making them more receptive to nationalist appeals and potentially less supportive of broad redistribution programs that would also benefit immigrants.
So it's not necessarily about them suddenly becoming free market capitalists, but more about who they see as us versus them.
That's one interpretation the paper offers, yes. A shift in identity focus rather than purely economic ideology.
Okay, so summing this all up then, it really feels like the big takeaway is that social identity, this balance between feeling primarily part of a nation versus feeling primarily part of an economic class, is a hugely important, maybe even dominant factor in shaping our views on redistribution.
Absolutely. It often seems to overshadow simple economic self-interest. We started with that puzzle. Why do people in similar economic spots have such different views?
And this deep dive gives us a framework. Those ideas of group status, perceived similarity, how they feed into class versus national identity, they really do offer some potential aha moments.
Hopefully for you listening, too, it provides a different lens to look through.
Definitely. It makes you reconsider current political debates, doesn't it? You start thinking about the language used. Is it emphasizing we're all in this together as a nation? Or is it highlighting class divisions? This research suggests that choice of emphasis might be very strategic.
Indeed. So for you listening, maybe reflect on this. What factors in your own country or community seem to be pushing people towards stronger national identity versus stronger class identity right now?
Yeah, think about the news you consume, the speeches you hear. Where's the focus?
Yeah.
Because according to this work, that focus has real consequences for economic policy.
And maybe here's a final thought to chew on. If we understand these psychological drivers better, this interplay of identity and economics, could that lead to more productive conversations? Could it help us design better policies around inequality and social welfare?
That's the big question, isn't it? Can understanding the why help us find better solutions? Something to think about.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, if you've got sources you want us to tackle, send them our way. We really enjoy digging into these complex topics with you. Until next time.